think that's it for our housekeeping. So welcome again. If you're just hopping in now, welcome to our very first brown bag presentation of Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month. We are thrilled to bring you Ice Age archaeology today. So we're going to go back over 10,000 years into the past with Dr. Daron Duke. So Dr. Duke has been an archaeologist here in the Great Basin for 25 years, and he's currently principal investigator at Far Western Anthropological Research Group. He specializes in early period archaeology, in pre-contact land use, and stone tool economies. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Nevada at Reno and has been doing absolutely amazing archaeological research ever since. We are so honored to have Dr. Duke join us for our brown bag lecture today. And Daron, I will turn it over to you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, well, thank you for that nice introduction. Let me share my screen here. Well, thank you for inviting me. I guess to start Historic Preservation Month off, you might as well start at the start, the really early archaeology of Utah. And, you know, I want to begin with really the acknowledgements. You know, I've got some acknowledgements at the end of the slide, but given what we're here to start with today, which is, you know, really a nationwide preservation month. You know, this archaeology is all on Air Force land out in the West Desert. Basically the area along I-80 until you get to Wendover, the Great Salt Lake Desert. And it's through the Air Force, Hill Air Force Base, and out on the Utah Test and Training Range that this is possible. And as far as preservation goes, you may not think of a military range as the first place for preservation, but in fact, a lot of ranges, and I work on other ones too, are great, almost park-like preserves for archaeology. The public hasn't been out there. And the Air Force, beginning about 20 years ago, especially with Janie Hershey, really set to doing an amazing job with stewardship of this record, which the signature record out there is this really old archaeology, preserving it, taking care of it. Now, Anya Kitterman now is doing most of that. And both of them, you know, really just deserve a lot of credit. And I want to say that up front, because what you're about to see is really a testament to the Air Forces and their desire to keep everything highlighted. So it's beyond compliance, it's more like stewardship. And I think we all should appreciate that. So I just want to begin, okay, we call this Lost Oasis. Well, there's a projectile point in my hand there at the beginning. That's called a Haskett point. We'll get to that. And in the background is a big, dry, open Great Salt Lake Desert, probably about 30 miles south of the interstate. And it used to be a vast wetland. So the contrast is amazing, and we'll get into it. So, you know, imagine something a little more like this. You have, this is a mural done for the Nature Conservancy by a guy named Larry Eifert. This is the Carson wetlands, or the Lahontan Basin, which would be the counterpart to the Bonneville Basin, which we're in out here, the old Ice Age lake. And this is just a really great, I've always liked this picture, really kind of tells a tale of what it would have looked like versus what it looks like now. I can imagine that being the Cedar Mountains to the east over there. I can imagine people out on that plain, and I can imagine them hitting just the sides of the marsh. It would have been quite different than today. And those of you in Utah know what the Great Salt Lake looks like. It's very salty. Of course, this would have been more freshwater back in the Pleistocene, but still, the flyway, the birds, the way it comes to life, that's what you have to imagine, and you have to imagine it on a much grander scale. So just to put a little more of a real picture to it. So this is a picture of, let's say, now and then. This is Blue Lake currently out just south of Wendover. It's a spring complex that issues out onto the playa. And even that's kind of what you might have expected the entirety of these wetlands, which we call the old riverbed delta for reasons I'll get to shortly. And even this is kind of tame. Imagine more plants, more cattails, bulrush, willow, sprawled all over the entirety of it. Look below and you see my colleague Craig Young walking on what is essentially a moonscape. And wind has been the dominant erosional force out here since the last 9,000 years since this place dried up. And it wasn't really till the 90s until anybody, Brooke R. Cush out of Weber State was one of the people who first got out there really appreciating this and recording it for the Air Force. All these, just tons of archaeology, old archaeology. What were people doing? What were they on? So we have stark contrast. And I'll get into the prettier pictures here shortly, but I think maps are good to start with to get everybody calibrated. And what you're looking at here is kind of topographic map. Get the green is the literal Great Basin as it's usually defined, which doesn't drain to an ocean. And so it's filled with lots of little basins, and they just drain to themselves, and sometimes they fill up with water. In the Pleistocene, they did that. What you're looking at here, you see the old riverbed delta. It's named that because there is a old channel carved into the hills coming down, south from about Delta to the Great Salt Lake Desert. And that's a Pleistocene river, essentially. It was an overflow river because there was a lake down there and it drained into the lake up here. And that big fan-like structure you see coming out onto the desert floor, that's a bunch of channels of the old riverbed as it just distributed out onto the flats. And it would have been a huge, and if you just look at this map, you understand why, a huge wetland complex. So for the nothingness it is now, the contrast is that it would not only have been an attractive wetland for people and animals and everything else, just life in general, it would have been about the biggest one in the entire Great Basin and Desert West. So it was of pivotal importance at the time. The names of sites you see on here, not too big of a deal to get into them, but they represent sites where this projectile point style we're talking about, which is kind of the earliest one out here out west we call Haskett, because, and there's I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a Haskett. This site up here in Idaho is called Haskett because these points were found and identified in the 60s on a guy's land named Haskett. But these are the sites, and you can see they transect across the Great Basin. And, these folks were getting around. We'll get into that a little bit, but that just sort of sets the table. And, archaeologically, there's a lot of debate out there about who the first people in North America were, and probably they came down the coast, and their timing is, hotly debated. I like to just be a pure archaeologist about it and say, what's the first evidence directly that I can see? And in Utah, it is about 13,000 years ago. And those records are that you see Bonneville Estates there, that's just south of Wendover, another place called Smith Creek Cave. Those are both caves with hearths that date up to 13,000 years ago and later. There's evidence up in Oregon that of people, there's just no stone associated, maybe 14,000 years ago, but there is a really interesting coincidence of that timing with when the lake bed became the huge wetland that it is, which looks to be about 13,000 years ago. And I think I have a little animation here. I forgot about that. You all in Utah especially will know Lake Bonneville and what that means. Right now, the Great Salt Lake, as great as it is really just something of a dwindled puddle, right? Compared to Lake Bonneville. You can kind of see it down in this map lower right. And that lake started to drain away in about 14,000 years ago. And it got down far enough that it, the Great Salt Lake Desert is essentially the lake bed. And at that point, but there was still a lot of water. So it's draining out onto the flats. It's creating a fresh water wetland. And it looks like that might have been what really attracted people. The second thing I'll bring up is Clovis, because it always is a layer we have to get into. Clovis, for those, and I'm going to assume on the part of most people listening, have heard of Clovis because it dominates talk of early people in North America. Often it has for decades. It's a point type. I'll show you soon, but it dominates. It's proven that people using Clovis points killed megafauna like mammoths. But it diminishes in the Intermountain West where we are. And what seems to be the other side of that is Haskett. Not so well known, but and unfortunately it doesn't come along with a mammoth kill, but the preservation out west is horrible. And we don't know if that not having that data yet mean that those data don't exist. But we have kind of a gap. And what's important is that the old riverbed delta now and the Haskett situation is really a key locality to the archaeology of the earliest people of the Great Basin. Really how it got settled, I guess, in big picture and how we can see it archaeologically. This is a picture of a Haskett point, a really great picture of one, taken by a guy named Pete Bostrom, who runs this lithic casting lab. We found this on the old riverbed in 2012. And you can even get a reproduction of it at this website. But it is the functionally biggest projectile point in the United States. Like I said, anyone's guess to what it was used for, but hey, we could make an educated guess, perhaps. Just take note of how nice it is, how well flaked it is, and everything. And that's just to give you a quick visual as we get a little farther down here. So what I want to do basically is set this up like a story to introduce you to the players. So I'm going to focus on the earliest part of what is essentially a 3,000 year kind of window that straddles the Holocene. So the Pleistocene, when we say Ice Age, we usually mean the Pleistocene, right? That's the end of that's the end of the Pleistocene when people first got here, and there was still water persisting into the Holocene, but it dried up by about 9,000 years ago in many places, or variably wherever you're at. And so we're going to focus on the early end, but by the end of this talk, I'll discuss the change through time and what's implicated, and what does all this stuff really mean from how people lived in Western Utah. And so we're going to use some of these points as kind of little bit players here. So this one we kind of just called the needle. We have some names for a few big ones just so we can give them a little personality. The needle, it looks like a needle, but it's also kind of the needle in the proverbial haystack, given that I've worked out there for 15 years before we found this area with this old of archaeology. And that's almost 100,000 acres of walking with teams of people. So there's been a lot of work. And so this is something of a payoff in that regard to really how we really started learning what was going on. This one, there's me, it's in my left hand there, but this is the one you saw in my hand on the first slide. It, the mammoth killer. And most notably, it tested positive in a residue study, protein residue. People can analyze this. Came out positive for protein residue consistent with the elephant family, which in these parts would be mammoth. There isn't really another option. Now, the method is somewhat controversial, but it is what it is. And, I've never gotten that result on a later period point. So there's something compelling about it when you match it up with the size of these things. This one we call the Rosetta Stone. That's a kind of technological nerd thing by me, because If you look at this one, this is made from obsidian from about 200 kilometers to the south, kind of Cedar City area. And if you look, I hope you can see my cursor. I don't know if you can, but if you look at the tips on both sides of this, there's a fracture that's called an impact fracture running down it. So this got broke, someone re-tipped it. That's something that they did regularly. So the size that we see isn't always, the original size. Usually they reworked it. And at the bottom, you can even see a break. That's either an old break or an old platform from the original blank that it was made off of. So this was very telling artifact from a technological perspective of what people do. This one we call the heavy hitter, jokingly. We have a lawyer down here in Vegas who calls himself the heavy hitter, and he's actually, it's unkind to Haskett points to think of him, but either way, this one has an impact fracture on the tip of it too. It's a little more subtle to see. Call it the heavy hitter because by proportion, it would be bigger than the big long one we showed you. It's beefier, and it has been broken. You can look and you see it doesn't have a very good tip. It's not pointy, but it does look like people made these projectile points first and knives second. They probably broke them. They may have, it looks like they transitioned them into kind of knife function, and that may be why we have as many as we can find. Back to the subject of Clovis points. This is just an example, and like I said, Clovis has dominated American thought about the first peoples, and a lot of that is now kind of out the window as far as them being first people of the Americas. To me, as a guy who really focuses on the technology itself, technology doesn't spring out of nothing. It comes from people figuring out a problem they want to solve, and it kind of has a prerequisite need for people to be here before it emerges. Clovis technology is known before about 13,000 years ago, maybe earlier. And this is just an example of them. What is most notable about it? If you look, you see something called a flute. The archaeologists call it a flute. Flake scar that runs from the base to the tip. It's especially obvious in this illustration. But it's captivated a lot of the American mind about what was going on in the Ice Age. You have National Geographic devoted this kind of noteworthy issue. I believe it's in the 80s. And we'll get back to that. But this is kind of, if you want to put Utah in context, these are the things going on. Some kind of big projectile technology that would look like two solutions to the same problem, but for the lack of direct evidence on the former. Let's just put some scale in here and say, what does a mammoth look like compared to a person? Mammoth, Columbian mammoth, which were the type around the West at the end of the Pleistocene, were the largest elephant family species there were. About 14 feet at the shoulder. They were big. One thing about them is those who know this well, what they need most, as do other big megafauna herbivores, is water. You need lots of water. And if you think of that map earlier, I didn't say this at the time, but the Haskett sites we see are distributed around the edges of the Great Basin, especially the Bonneville and Lahontan basins, where there was lots of water. In the middle of Nevada, the relief is higher and there isn't as much water. And it doesn't look like there was much going on there. In terms of archaeological evidence, there's not much. So let's just get into this timeline to really set up our Ice Age timeline for the area. So, this says the Great Plains. It's kind of meant to capture the fluted point stuff. So you got Clovis after 13,500, probably closer to 13,000 by current thought. And I say Great Plains because it's the place with different preservation. It's a place with a lot of the buried sites, and it has a sequence that's been dated, and it's got known evidence of people interacting with these fauna and all that. So we'll just, it's really about time, but it's also a neighboring region to the Great Basin, especially for Utah. There's a subtype, another fluted point type called Folsom after that. And that takes us through basically the end of the Pleistocene. So the end of the Ice Age, these fluted points were dominant on the Great Plains. After that, there's something in the plains they call the Cody complex, which is essentially stem points. Haskett is kind of the initiating version of a Western stemmed point, as people out west call them, the series. And there's several varieties of these Cody stem points, but they are stemmed points. And it looks like they are things that emanated from out west, from the Great Basin and the Intermountain West at large. So the Great Basin, what have we got? Well, we got Haskett, we've got demonstrated dates, and I'll get to a site we've already excavated on the old riverbed soon that proves, we have them out there in the 12 to 13,000 time frame. The Bonneville Estates Rock Shelter I mentioned has the dates going almost to 13,000 years ago. And then we have a stemmed point complex that I'll show you some pictures. It continues. So whatever fluted points represent technologically, it seems like on both the Great Basin and the plains that they ultimately were replaced by stemmed technology, kind of a subplot in the big story. Oh, and incidentally, these are the regional dates, paleontological dates on mammoth remains in the Great Basin. They happen to overlap Haskett technology. So I want to talk about the Haskett site we excavated, telling us a lot about what life was like for these people. And you see right there, compliments to the photographer from the Air Force who did this fisheye stuff to show everything. You have a hearth. You can kind of see it there in the left side of the screen. It's got a hole in it. I'll explain that. But this was something we saw right on the surface. You see how big and vast everything is, but at another time, it would have been right on the edge of the wetlands. The Wishbone site is well known. I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about today, by the way, is available online to look at if you're interested in just looking at stories and things about it. It's an important site, and this is how we found it. Just, you can see this gray smudge kind of in the upper right of the circle. The circle's drawn with a pin flag to encompass all the artifacts laying around it. You'll even see over here the remains of a gun belt thing that probably fell out of an airplane. Fortunately, fell on the other side of this. This is it, the way we saw it. Charcoal kind of being eroded out of the ground. Little fragments of bone, which turned out to be waterfowl bone, by and large duck bone. And you can see even burned bone. When it's gray like this, it's burned. And here's just another example of what it looks like. What's notable, and you can see all the salt. And one reason we struggle with preservation out on the Great Salt Lake Desert is this. The interesting thing about the Great Salt Lake Desert is that it's actually moist under the ground, immediately under the ground. You can even see that it's moist there. And everything was preserved perfectly right below the surface. But the minute it's within a centimeter of the surface and the wet-dry cycles of the desert start to act on bone, all that salt gets in the little pores and the wet-dry cycles just expand and it just blows apart. And in one season, these little bones could be absolutely blown away. So we intersected something unique at a unique time. So we wanted to double check because it's relevant. We find black stains on the desert floor all the time. They relate to those old wetlands, or the mud from, you might imagine, down in the reeds and everything. That stuff is organic and it stays black as you go through time, and it's buried. And we can get dates out of this, which is how we've gotten dates for the old riverbed. But so we dug a hole according to the Air Force's guidelines on how to record and evaluate for National Register eligibility and significance. We dug a small hole, a 50 by 50 centimeter hole that was designed to bisect the stained area. It was kind of hard to tell. It wound up taking a lot of the stained area out of it, but a simple hole. And this is what it looked like, which still wasn't very obvious, I guess. But it definitely was charcoal, and it definitely had artifacts surrounding it. So it seemed to be important. And you can see we took dates out of it. I'm actually going to go to the next slide to discuss that. So what did this simple 50 by 50 centimeter probe tell us? And we didn't go much farther down than that before we were out of the deposit, a few centimeters. We got pieces of charcoal. We were able to see what kind of charcoal, of willow wood, 3 pieces of willow wood charcoal. We got dates on each of them. Willow would be about the best fuel wood option in an open wetland. And there's none out there now, that's for sure. 3 dates that pretty much converge, and that gives us an approximate, really calendric date, or calibrated date, as we say, of 12,300 years ago. We found 316 bone fragments, burned and unburned. That MNI represents the minimum number of individuals. That's like how many ducks do they represent if you looked at the elements. Looks like 3 or 4 based on just the simple small hole. We found gastroliths, or basically gizzard stones. Found solid rocks, and we found one is a little concretion. The upper right one is a little concretion, like you'd have from, it's made of, it's calcic. We put it on a machine that told us that, and it also had little feather filaments sticking out of it. So we know, you know, it's organic. Something like a kidney stone or anything else would have the same kind of composition. And there's no other rocks out there. So you can't explain the rocks by something else. They're in the hearth. Either people threw them in there, or something else, like they came out of the duck's entrails, which people were probably throwing in the fire. We found on the surface around the hearth 7 tools, including this thing. It doesn't look as snazzy as the other Haskett points I showed you, but it is a fragment of one. Somebody just, it looks like, kind of killed it. They smashed it one way, then another, and then tossed it aside. Maybe it was used up, and we don't know. And there were 11 flakes that were found within the feature fill. So we definitely had a Haskett site, all this. The final thing we found in that, we did plant remains. We take all the material back and do what we call manual flotation to get all the remains. We have them in our lab. We analyze them, look for seeds. We found tobacco seeds. That find alone was very important. Found 4 of them, and it just gives you some insight into people. You know, this is a campfire scene, and we're getting all the little pieces of what's going on out here. It may seem kind of routine. You know, this is what people do. Fireside activity, eating ducks, not mammoths, but I don't know. I don't know if you'd eat a mammoth every day. Ducks have been thought of by many as really a substrate food that people would eat regularly. And then enjoying tobacco. So in the end, we went out again. I think this was 2016, and we dug the site formally. See the hearth there where we had took the 50 by 50 centimeter probe, and you see some more staining around it. And this is just a kind of an inventory of some of the interesting things. That little Haskett fragment I showed you is their letter B. It turns out A, up in the upper left corner, is another Haskett fragment that refits with that, and it was found in the feature fill. And it's also broken and messed up. It's from a source called Wild Horse Canyon Obsidian, and it's from almost 200 kilometers to the south. It looks like somebody, maybe it was expended, somebody maybe handed it over to somebody else who's, could be just practicing, could be a child, could be anybody, but it looks like they just sort of hit it hard in a few places, broke it in half, threw one half in the fire, and dropped the other half on the ground. The site, we called it the Wishbone site. There's a wishbone, but mostly it's kind of It was full of duck bone, although there were a few mammal bones in there. Their letter E is a incised bone, piece of mammal bone. And what we think that is, there are a few other Haskett sites from like up in Oregon and elsewhere that have these little scored bones, and they look like they're manufacturing beads. You score the bone, you snip the thing off, and then maybe drill a hole in it, but we haven't found any beads. It's just a speculation. And then D, just about a meter from the hearth, is a full-on Haskett point, a nice one. It's a little shorter. It looks like it's been worked down. Maybe it's a knife. And so it really turned into the site that just kept on giving as showing you what people were doing around a fire. You got a few people working there. You have Tim Danny's from Timo Western Shoshone, and he thought this was amazing. His help was and insights were great to have out there, and so it was a really good experience. And just to kind of cap that up, this is what it looks like. You have the center of the feature, the periphery of it, and then we even have the red staining around it where it's oxidized from the heat. So we have a dead ringer hearth site. And for a place that's so unyielding, we've now learned what the context is, and that has us searching for more. And yeah. And oh, by the way, you know, the thing about tobacco, you know, we dug the site, and I'm prepared to talk about all this stuff about people out west as an archaeologist. The tobacco thing was a completely surprising find that took it to a different level, because that has implications that a lot of people who don't worry about archaeology out west think about. Human use of intoxicant plants, you know, plants that aren't necessarily used for food. And this is just showing you, we published this. It became the big priority story of the site. So we worked on that first. And, you know, there's some really cool implications from that. The thing is that the tobacco at the site is 9,000 years earlier than anybody's ever been able to demonstrate humans using tobacco. And this talk isn't about tobacco. There's a whole article we wrote about it. To exclude natural reasons why the tobacco would be in the hearth. It's kind of a dry upland plant, not a wetland plant. But it's something that people who study this stuff would have assumed, right? Like the people would have early figured out how to use tobacco, but finding evidence of it, direct evidence, is very hard because it's just really a seasonal weed in a sense, but with a lot of importance. And the seeds are, you know, less than a millimeter. So what a unique situation. And there are other seeds in the hearth, just to add to what's going on here. There were something called red maize. It's essentially kind of a herbaceous flower with seeds that people really valued, especially in the modern environment in California, and less so in the Great Basin, but that's in the hearth. And chenopodium, or basically goosefoot, pit seed goosefoot, something that some might consider like original quinoa, that's in the hearth as well. And those are plants that are commonly in hearths in the desert West. People relied on these seeds. There's a brand new article coming out in American Antiquity by a woman named Caitlin McDonough and colleagues that's about seed use in these early, you know, Pleistocene and early Holocene settings. And the Wishbone site now figures heavily into that, one of just a handful of sites that we're learning this about. So for all the talk we're devoting to mammoths and hunting and giant spear points, which are fun, let's not fool ourselves, it's really more fun as an archaeologist to get the full, you know, something out of a site that tells you all sides of life. I mean, we have a social angle, we have a dietary angle that covers all the bases on just an amazing site. And that was going out in the Western Desert 12,300 years ago. So I told you that I would bring this back around to change through time. And if you're a good archaeologist, it's like you got one job and it's changed through time. Maybe you got two jobs and it's finding stuff, then it's changed through time. Because time statically doesn't tell you anything you can learn so much. And this is a slide of Western stemmed points, as we call them. They're part of the same tradition. These are the people using these points that were using the old riverbed for a 3,000-year period before it dried up and went away. And there's some changes. You know, if this was a live audience and I was standing in front of you, I'd ask questions like, do you notice anything? But I don't, and I can't see any of you, so I'll just say there's two things I would highlight. And just notice we got a timeline from 13 to 10,000. They roughly change in size, for one. They get smaller. After you get past 12,000 or a little later, this Haskett and then what's called a Cougar Mountain style point disappear. Coincidentally, that's when, dead to rights, we know that megafauna have disappeared. You'll also notice that they kind of degrade in quality, or craftsmanship, we'll say. Now, I would say, you know, that is not because people lost their ability to make high quality artifacts. It's more of an investment thing. It's representing a change that people aren't as invested in hunting, essentially, as they were before. And there are a whole lot of other aspects of the technology we could go into that I can't today, but that seems to be the case. So we have a change through time, and it's interesting, and we might say, why? Well, to put a big context on this, let's say global warming 1.0 for people in America. We'll say North America. So the Pleistocene was wet and cold. The Holocene became warm and dry. And what that means, we're going to get into here, but what I want to first show you is those point styles, although we have some other sites we've gotten some dates on that help back up the story, but mostly we have hundreds and even several thousand of those Western stem points distributed across dated channels of the old riverbed. And you see that represented here. This is an image out in the middle of it all. What we got here is we know the channels date to different times. These are proven by ground truthing, and they're on aerial imagery. That's how we have them shown here. They're not artistic. Out west, the channels date to between 13 and 10. In the central, they date to between 12 and 9. And out east, they date to between 11 and 8. So as we can watch the archaeology, these projectile point types and the types represented, the technology associated with them kind of change through time. Now, what does that relate to? So you see the old riverbed delta over here to the east. What you're looking at here is a high stand model that me and another guy, Jay King, did and published about, and it's just showing you what the high stand lake levels were, you know, even maybe before people were here, but at their highest about 15,000 years ago. And we don't have the Lake Bonneville part in it because it is so big. It'll be bigger than this. But you see the Lahontan area on the east part or west part was big as well. Through the time frame of interest to us, we go from this to this. And I've got the old look down in the bottom left. But essentially, the Great Basin is drying up. And the reason that's important for the old riverbed delta is because it was such a big catchment that it didn't dry up while other things did. What it looks like is that people became more tied to it. Instead of moving around across the landscape, they devoted more to the old riverbed delta. And so that we've got a change through time whereby people are going from a high mobility to something more localized. That is manifest in the toolstone. So I just told you, where does the obsidian come from? We can chemically get a signature off of it. And we know where all the geologic sources are, more or less. And so we use that to tell us something about change through time. So what you're looking at here, that blue loop represents all the obsidian, the Haskett points made out of obsidian. And we have, I don't know, 100 of them. No, not 100, but a lot, almost 100. And they're always from a long way off. People were moving down near Cedar City or just north of that, and all the way up almost to Yellowstone. These sources are just getting everywhere. The gray loops you see below it, those are something another group of researchers did, which just averages what they found in the Great Basin for the whole time. It's not distinct to a certain point. You see it's smaller. And then if you go to the kind of 10,000 to 9,000 year time frame, those later stem points, this cloudy gray oval represents the majority of the sources used by people, all basically just the two closest sources. So we have this to tell us that, you know, this big dynamic is going on. So as you leave the Ice Age, what did people see? They had things kind of drying up on them in other areas of the Great Basin. They had water enduring in the Great Salt Lake Desert and those ORB wetlands. They went from long mobile ranges and probably a much sparser population on the landscape to a much smaller one. And even this really did, you know, when we hit what we call the middle Holocene, that's when it really gets dry. And it may have been, you know, we talk about change through time. We don't want to assume too much. People adjusted to things. They adapted. They were smart. But it doesn't mean it couldn't have been kind of harsh. And, you know, the minute the old riverbed dries up about 9,500 years ago, that's when we find the first evidence, and Utah is actually famous for this, was for a long time, for people starting to do other technology, moving out of the wet lowlands and up into upland areas. At Danger Cave there by Windover, that's where the earliest groundstone, at the time it was the earliest groundstone, about 9,500 years ago. People were grinding pickleweed seeds, and they're using a small seed complex to essentially mill seeds and use them for intensively. So it's like the faucet turned off out here and people changed. And the way they changed was something like we're familiar with the rest of prehistory, how people were adapted to the environment. And that's when this change happened. So I'm just going to wrap it up here. Future directions. This, what you're looking at on the left, is some artifacts that are eroding out of a landform that we now have proven is got an intact site in it. It's called the Hello site. We did test excavations and found another hearth. This site is only about 500 feet from the Wishbone site. It has 2 Haskett fragments associated with it. It has a hearth we clipped in the excavations, and we got a date out of it, and the date is essentially identical to the Wishbone site. And we are going to dig it this summer, working with the Air Force to get all that squared away. It's interesting in that it would look like much the same, except the tools are a little different, heavier duty. And the sourcing on the obsidian goes from the opposite. Wishbone site was to the south. This site, the Haskett points, are from almost Yellowstone, that far away. So that's right on the agenda. Also this summer, we're going to complete a geoarchaeological and paleoenvironmental sensitivity study to help identify and protect more early sites. To that point about preservation and what the Air Force is doing to help protect and preserve these kinds of sites, is that it's not just that we go out finding sites, we find contexts, and we want to be able to predict them as best we can. So through some further study of what we now learned and see how far it extends. And you know, the thing about this area that's really intriguing is that if we can find 2 hearths, 2's a pattern, 1's a fluke. And I can't tell you, I can't understate how important this locality becomes to a lot of the questions that people across North America have about how people came into the interior of the continent, settled it, became familiar with it, and lived their lives. Finally, we're working with the Air Force as well, just trying to seek more Native American perspective on every line. We hope to have people out when we're digging this summer. Continued talk, we have another project related to an ethnobotanical inventory, just learning about the plants of the range, getting people involved. The subject of tobacco is obviously very important from Native American perspective, and we just want to do a much more collaborative effort on the archaeology that's going on out here in the West Desert. And finally, I already kind of nodded to the Air Force folks, Janie Hershey and Anya Kitterman. I thank you personally, and I think it's really, really important, and it's a really important place that's being taken care of out there. So an apt place to begin Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month. If you want to learn more about this, like I said, there's a lot online. There is a video called A Point in Time that was done as an outreach video for the BLM in Nevada, but it includes our excavations at the Wishbone site. So that's kind of fun to see. I don't know, maybe I can put it in the chat, or I don't know if Savannah or Elizabeth can, the link. And right now, some of those Haskett points I showed you are on exhibit at the Natural History Museum of Utah. So I encourage you to visit the museum and see how it's represented there. And with that, I think I went under an hour, so seems to be about what I had planned. So thank you all for showing up. Happy to talk about this. It's been great fun to have an archaeology, something as silly as getting into archaeology actually result in such fun. So.
Yeah, thank you. That was super fun. I love this sort of stuff, and I can't wait to see what you guys get up to this summer. So our questions, our QAs have been coming in hot. So we've got a few, and I think by order of appearance, I'll start with Maria Guida's questions. She asked, did the lake, and I believe this is Lake Bonneville, drain to the north? Just a little bit about what actually happened to the lake, where those waters went.
Yeah, the lake dried and disappeared toward the north. The Great Salt Lake is what's left of it. It extended out to the south, and basically the Great Salt Lake Desert is the old lake bed. So where we're at is at a higher elevation, would be another way to put it, than the current Great Salt Lake. I mean, it's so flat and low, it's not by much, but so you can have a slight increase in the lake, it's spread out for miles. But yeah, that's true.
Okay, great. Thank you. She also asked, is there any relation or correspondence between the lithics found from this ice age, the time here in Utah, and the lithics in Siberia, so across Beringia?
None directly. There are currently people researching and making those connections. I think that if you take it at a very macro level, there are artifacts, points that kind of look like this, at least as a template, around the kind of Pacific Rim to Japan. You have this technology, and I don't like to get over my skis on what connections I'm making as an archaeologist. I would say that the technology, the base plate of it is simple to draw a line all the way to Japan and say it exists. But I think that goes for even Clovis points, that I describe them as different, but for a flute and the tapered look, they really are the same thing. They're big lanceolate points, conceivably, in my view, by two kind of traditions, maybe two cultural traditions, albeit within tolerances and to perform the same kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So function steering some of the design, but definitely similarities to be explored.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Also, just to let everyone know, we do have a lot of questions and we only have 4 minutes left. So
Oh, I should have shut up earlier.
no. This was wonderful. So we'll figure out how we can get some more of these questions answered. Dr. Duke, however long you're able to give us here this afternoon would be amazing.
Yeah, I don't mind staying on as long as anybody wants to hear it.
I think we've got a few people who are pretty interested. So we did have a couple of questions from Facebook. So Dan Pearson asked, can we trace the points of origin locations? And I believe this was in regards to those obsidian and maybe the fine grain volcanic, if you had those, and asking where they're from. And I know you'd mentioned the mineral mountains.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I covered your question eventually, depending on when you asked it, but the down to the south, the mineral mountains, the two sources, Black Rock area and Wild Horse, are important. Browns Bench is a huge source at the Nevada-Idaho border and Utah border. And Topaz Mountain, also south of Dugway, it's important. But those are the ones that drive the bus on most things. But Haskett, as we mentioned, in the Ice Age was different. This more local sources became the less used, which tells us something about just how fast moving and across the landscape some of these folks were. So, and there is other material types, and those sources are from around the basin as well.
That's awesome. We had another Facebook question about LiDAR, and if LiDAR could be useful helping spot some of these sites. And I'll expand that to say, are there any other sort of like remote sensing techniques that we might be able to use out there?
Yeah, LiDAR is something we've asked the Air Force about many times, but it's a sensitive area, the military range, and whether they have gotten it themselves, I think we are always looking to get it, or it just gets easier and easier all the time to maybe fly a drone at a low angle and produce it, but it's expensive. And so I guess the short answer is I haven't gotten that yet. I have thought about it. More intriguingly, we have a kind of trial, you call it a trial study this summer planned with someone who does remote sensing and magnetometry. And they think that they can see these hearths. And with them being so shallow, I'm actually pretty motivated about that, possibilities with that, because we have assemblages that look like they may be also eroding out. We have context we need to understand. I think there's some potential there. What they benefit from is not having to drive over a bunch of shrubs and not having a bunch of other rocks to confuse their information with. So pretty promising.
That would be really great, because that area is so fragile out there right now. Like you said, the next big windstorm could expose a site, could take a site away. So it'd be nice to know where these things are and keep an eye. Speaking of the Air Force, we had a question: does the Air Force prevent bombing and et cetera of such sites that you have found, and particularly things that might be eligible to be on the National Register of Historic Places? Maybe that's an Anya question, if Anya's still here.
Well, I'll go ahead and answer it for Anya from my perspective. And it's just simple. And the answer is yes. I mean, for one, the munitions are pretty, what do you want to call them? Good. They hit their targets pretty well. And their targets aren't near these areas. And now that they've been identified, they're already avoiding them. And so I would, that's part of the whole stewardship and preservation angle that I was bringing into the fold. And if Anya wants to talk to it, she can. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll say, Anya, if you've got anything else to add, just raise your hand if that was sufficient. Oh, Anya in the chat says, yes, we avoid sites. We do early planning to ensure new missions don't impact sites. I suspected that might be the answer, but I'm glad you spoke up, Anya. Thank you for that.
Well, I'll just say the future work that we talked about is all driven by that whole idea, like understanding, modeling the potential and subsurface potential. It helps them plan how to get around things before they even can get in trouble with it. So it's really all about advanced planning, and we're actively working on that.
Yep. And so if you know Utah well, or if you know the West Desert here in Utah, you know that we're talking about an area that's owned by the Air Force. Below there is an area called Dugway. I believe that's also owned by the US military, but it's a different administrative unit. And we had a question about, do you have any plans to work with Dugway down there, since Old Riverbed does go through much of the Dugway Proving Ground?
Well, I have over the years collaborated in various ways with Dugway Proving Ground, the archaeologists there, Jenny DeGraff and Reed, Rachel Quist and company. Also, there's other researchers, David Madsen and colleagues have worked on the Old Riverbed. There is a monograph at the University of Utah Press about the Old Riverbed. I should have mentioned that. I mean, that's largely driven by the work on Dugway. I didn't bring it up because I've never formally worked on Dugway. I've only kind of collaborated, and although it's the same old riverbed, they have different signatures, and there's no sites like this down there. Not worth getting into the details, but the answer is yes, but I don't have any particular projects, I guess would be, if that's the question. You know, I'm not working down there, but I am fully in friendly collaboration with those who know the record down there, and we work on a lot of fronts together with the lithic sourcing, chemical sourcing, and all that, and what's going on. So yeah.
Yeah, and Justin Bracken just linked to that monograph from the University of Utah in the chat here, and I put it in Facebook. It's called The Paleoarchaic Occupation of the Old Riverbed Delta, if anyone's interested. I think it would be a fantastic read.
Yeah, one thing important about that is that this early stuff came out. We found this stuff as that monograph was being finalized. That monograph is a story of mostly the early Holocene archaeology. It's been in recent years that this Pleistocene component has really become understood, and mostly on the Air Force land.
I was still muted. Great. Carter Williams, who is a reporter out here for KSL. He's been following the story for many years of the drying Great Salt Lake. As you've probably heard, that's accelerating right now due to many seasons of some pretty severe drought we've been having. He would like to know, is there anything from this prehistory that you find relevant to issues regarding our modern day drying of the Great Salt Lake?
Well, if you mean environmentally, I can only speak to the fact that it gets warmer, the water dries up, and we seem to be getting into a next level mode of warming. And, you know, ultimately, if I want to go behavioral about it, I'd just get really kind of epic and say, you know, it matters in the desert when your water goes away, and it mattered to these folks in the past, and it matters now. They couldn't stop it. Can we? I don't know.
It's a little hard, right? Because this is 13,000 years ago. So the human connections might not be there, because this was a few people, their lifestyles were a lot different.
Let me say one little angle about it. One thing we know from data, from paleoenvironmental data, is that the temperature in the Bonneville Basin in the Pleistocene at this time was some 14 degrees cooler on average. And what that means for the water, some say at that end of the Pleistocene it was actually drier. Precipitation-wise, it was dry, but it was so much cooler that evaporation was stalled or limited. And that's what led to all the lakes of the Great Basin. It was cooler and they didn't evaporate. When it gets warmer, they evaporate. And so that model is part of the story of how different today, you know, you might compare today to then.
Can I ask a clarification? You say it's 14 degrees, or had been 14 degrees cooler at the end of the Pleistocene, correct? Is that
something like that?
Fahrenheit?
6 to 7 degrees Celsius.
Celsius, thank you. I was not sure which one that was. And
Yeah. I was trying to do the math here. I don't know if I got it right, but I
So-
do know the 6 to 7 is in the literature.
6 to 7 Celsius. Got it.
Yeah.
We'll work from there. We can do those conversions on our own. So we had a few more questions. I'm gonna start taking them a little bit out of order here. Hey, Daron, and this is from Kirk Halford. Maybe you guys know each other. Hey, Daron, can you speak to the fact that WST, Western STEM tradition, occurs pre-Clovis at Cooper's Ferry, Paisley Caves, and the Galt sites? How does that fit into the Western STEM tradition chronology and peopling of the Americas? I'm a big fan of this question, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Well, how I tried to make it fit before you asked that question was that I'm going to stick to Utah and not get too far out into that. But those sites show convincingly that there were people in the Americas. Let's just take ourselves out of the Bonneville Basin for the moment. He's mentioning the Galt site is in Texas, Cooper's Ferry is in Idaho. They convincingly show people by some 15 to 16,000 years ago on the land. Their correspondence with Western stemmed points is a little more debatable. The stated claim at Cooper's Ferry is that the stemmed points that are early, they aren't Haskett points. There's something they call Lint Cooley out there. And they're smaller. They would look a little bit more like the smaller points we have in the later time frame here. They're from a cache that it doesn't date as early as that earliest date. It's some, maybe I think the claim is more like 14,000. And they do stand out as a little bit different. They're still part of the whole Western stemmed complex. The Galt site in Texas has something that looks like a stem point with little shoulders on it, also not a Haskett point, but it has an indented base and, you know, a couple other flaking mods, and you would be maybe a precursor to a Clovis point. So maybe the best answer for your question, Kirk, is that it looks like people are dabbling with these technologies, in my personal opinion, prior to 13,000 years ago, and that a stem point could be the base plate for both a Clovis and a stem point, and they could come from different directions. If you're in Texas, it turned into fluted points, and if you're out west, emanating from the northwest, it became Haskett points. These people ultimately saw each other and talked shop or whatever they did, and maintained two separate traditions, but still same size scale and all that. And so that's, I guess that's a running, like, that's my thought on it. That's maybe just a hypothesis, but I tend to think of things as far as how the technology works. And that's the way I see it.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much. Our last group of archaeologically based questions are about those tobacco seeds. And that's something that I was really fixated on as well. So the tobacco seeds found are the oldest in what type of geographical designation? And Lisa Robertson, the question asker, is saying, are these the oldest tobacco seeds found in North America, in the Western Hemisphere, in the world? I guess she would like to know, where does it fit in our understanding of tobacco use as a human species, if you know that information?
Yeah, well, for one thing, it's an America's plant. Now there is tobacco species, there's some in Australia that people use, there's some in even Africa, but they're very much lighter. Nobody brought those over here. The people that came into the Americas didn't have familiarity with tobacco. We would assume they had familiarity with the effects of plants of some nature that we don't know, but that's one thing that's important about it, is that it's something people figured out soon and in the Americas. Now, as far as what's first about what, botanically speaking, I can't cover all the, somebody did core somewhere in another discipline and found tobacco seeds and never reported it. I don't know, but this is the earliest botanically demonstrated evidence for tobacco in the Americas. And that means that I'll back that up with, there's a lot of discussion going from all the way to the 50s until up to recently. There were theories about whether tobacco, because there are a lot of subspecies, right? The species that are domesticated are not what was used out here. This was a species called Nicotiana attenuata. It was commonly used by people. It's a desert tobacco. Some thought the desert tobaccos were brought here by people, not until the agricultural times of just a few thousand years ago. But now we have like paleogenomics on the tobacco plant that prove it's been evolving variously across the Americas for millennia, million years or something like that. And but they're little bitty seeds. So their first evidence botanically turns out to be their first evidence archaeologically. Until we found these seeds, they've been found in the Southwest in caves where they're preserved, but mostly in the last, couple thousand years. Other information comes from pipe residues, and that's not seeds, that's nicotine residue. And we know that people were using pipes back to some 6,000 years at least. And that includes the Great Basin and out to the east. What do you think was in them? There are other things that people used, of course. But what we're learning through all these studies by all these researchers doing this stuff is that tobacco seems to be primary, except under certain circumstances, and sometimes mixed with things. So you'll find other things. So I guess that's what I have to say about that. That cover everything you asked me?
That did. That also covered an additional question about local or imported. So these are local tobacco plants that were originating in North America, and throughout the millennia to follow, were grown hither and yon across the continent, it sounds like.
Right.
Cool. The last set of questions, we had many people who are dying to volunteer.
Really?
A lot of people would love to volunteer to help. So I understand that this is on, Department of Defense land, but they would like to know if you need any help on anything like this, or, if you could think creatively about where someone might be able to put their time.
Well, I would say that I'm tempted to open myself up and say, everybody send me something, but I think it's a very small site we have to dig this summer. And I think I've got everyone accounted for in terms of some students and employees that have to work on it. We can only fit so many people in a certain spot. And yeah, the Air Force policy, if this was not in Air Force land, for example, I would be working to make it an outreach oriented dig. If I was able, if this was in the middle of Salt Lake City, I would hope to rotate people who wanted to lend a hand or open the public to be able to come walk through with a tour guide. But that's just not the way we can do it out there, unfortunately. But I definitely appreciate that. And certainly, I think in the top of the list is usually students and stuff like that. So, yeah.
It's hard to absorb volunteers. I would say to that end, if someone is here in Utah and they are looking for a way to get out and do something about archaeology, we do have a site stewardship program, the Utah Cultural Site Stewardship Program. And that also will give you opportunities for additional ways to literally get your hands dirty. We had a question in Facebook from Dan Pearson who asks, how do we follow and see the results of your upcoming field season? Maybe this is a good chance to let people know where to follow you.
Well, when we dug the Wishbone site, we already had some interest publicly, and there was this video that you put the link in there for that was ongoing, so it got out there a little bit faster. This one's kind of like just haven't been able to, let's say, publicize it, or I don't know how soon it is going to be that I would be reporting out whatever we find. If we find something really important, I'm sure we, and I mean we as in ANYA and the Air Force and everything, we would want to make it known. But I think that actually, I guess I'll speak for the Air Force here and say what they did last time is they did make some things available. They did a little, their public relations had some stuff. So we may be able to get that, and then we could push it around on Facebook once, you know, we have to clear like photographs and there's things like that. And if the tobacco seeds are any evidence, you know, it took me like, it was, you know, 5 years to get the thing published. But this stuff takes time, right? I can tell you, if we dig the site, find a mammoth tusk or a ivory flute or anything like that, I'm going to want to tell everybody ASAP, and you'll find out about that. But we don't know what we'll find yet.
Yeah, such as all archaeology work, right? If you find something that's big and obvious, but sometimes the amazing things are those little tobacco seeds. You don't know until you've done a lot of tests and invested.
Well, these questions are really good, though. I mean, I have had it in the back of my mind to think maybe a little more aggressively how we might, in real time, report on what we're doing. But because of the Air Force Base, it hasn't ever been a thing before, but I'm not sure it's not something we couldn't figure out. So it's good. I'm glad you asked, you know, as we nail our logistics down over the next month and 2 months, it's something that you're just kind of getting me going, thinking about here. So thank you.
Well, perfect. Glad to sort of put the bug in your ear. And you have made it through our amazing gauntlet of questions. Thank you so much for giving us so much more of your time. And thank you for those of you who are able to stick it out. We really appreciate your time here on this Wednesday. So I just want to close letting you guys know that this is just the first in our series. We have 3 more brown bag events. So if this was something that was really up your alley, please join us for the next 4 weeks coming up, 3 weeks coming up, as we continue our series. So next week we will have Roger Roper on talking about the legacy of Carnegie libraries here in Utah. And I'll tell you, I've been editing one of the videos for it and it nearly brought me to tears. We also have our full listing of events. That's us and all of our partners. So if you want to get outside, I mean, we're doing a lot of virtual stuff right here, right now. But, you know, I know this weekend we've got hiking tours. There's pottery on the plateau. Fremont Indian State Park is doing a lot. So check out our full listing at bit.ly/Utah AHP 2022. The link is in the chat and the link is also on our Facebook. And then if you want to follow, you know, Daron, please do at Far Western, I believe, on Facebook. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not personally on Facebook. Our company is Far Western Anthropological Research Group. I'm on Twitter.
Oh, perfect.
Twitter a little bit, science messaging only, usually. And that's where I usually talk if there's anything to talk about.
That's awesome. Cool. And so we are also on all the socials. We are at Utah SHPO on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and we are SHPO Utah on Twitter. We are Utah State Historic Preservation Office on YouTube. And so this video will be available tomorrow. So if you missed any part of it, if you want to go back and rewatch, it will be archived on the internet for you to go back to view at your leisure. So one more time, just thank you so much, Daron. This has been amazing. And we were so excited to have you on to kick off Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, everybody who came to hear it. It's fun to talk about, and I appreciate your time.
We really appreciate you. Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next week on Wednesday at noon. See you guys.
Bye.